we just finished installing another 400 amp hour lithium power system in this van. And the next step is to program each of the pieces of equipment. If you don't program them, the system will not work correctly. So we're going to take you through each piece of equipment, show you what settings we use, and then we're going to start up the system. So let's jump right in. Let's take a look at each of the components in the system. And what we have here is our 400 amp hour lithium power bundle. This is a great power system for, I'd say, about 75% of people who have a 144 van. This would be perfect. So really quickly on the components, we have 400 amp hours of lithium power storage, a solar charge controller, Links distributor, the Smart BMS CL12100. We are also using the Victron Smart Shunt and the MultiPlus 3000 inverter, and then finally the Serbo with the display. So if you want more information on this system, we've done a video which goes over the whole system in detail, which you can find right here. But for now, let's just jump into the programming of the system, and that all starts with downloading the Victron Connect app. And once you download it and open it up, you'll be able to see each of the pieces of equipment that are within range. All of these are Bluetooth enabled. Just about every piece of Victron equipment is or will be very soon. And that's really handy because you can just download the app, and rather than dig around in here and test things, you can find out a lot about your system just through looking at the app. Let's start with the battery. So you'll pull out your Victron Connect app and you'll see all of your batteries in the app. You click on your first battery, and with all of the pieces of equipment, the first screen you get is information about what's going on with that piece of equipment. Each will also have a gear icon up in the right hand corner. Click into that and it will give you the settings, and then there's one more menu, these three dots, and if you go to product info, then you can set the name and the PIN code for each of the pieces of equipment individually. So that's really useful because it just names them something generic with a long string of letters and numbers. So if you want to know which piece of equipment you're really looking at, especially here, we have multiple vans, that's where you go to name everything. So back to the battery settings, we actually leave these at the factory defaults, which is to restore to defaults. And so that would be the allowed to discharge voltage is 2.8, the cell under voltage is 3.1, the allowed to charge minimum temperature is 5 degrees Celsius, and that equates to about 41 degrees Fahrenheit. So at that temperature, the batteries will no longer charge. And if you needed to charge them deeper than that, then you could go in there and change that setting. There's also a battery temperature offset. So if you know the battery temperature is different than what it's reading on here, you can go in there and make that adjustment. But that's pretty much it with the batteries. If you need to find out what's going on in terms of the voltage, the temperature, or the cell voltages individually, you can look at the app. But otherwise, there's nothing else to change on the battery. Okay, so next, let's do the solar charge controller. So find your Smart Solar on the Victron app, pull that up, and the home screen will give you, again, all the information that it's collecting about the solar panels and the batteries. And we will go into settings and then battery. So you want to make sure that the battery is set to 12 volts. The max charge current is 30 amps, and that is based on the unit that we have. The charger enabled button obviously needs to be switched on, so you'll get charging. And then finally, you want to make sure that it's selected to smart lithium batteries for your battery presets. And that's pretty much it. I leave everything else as the factory settings. And then finally, if you want to set a street light function, that is also in the settings menu. And basically what that will do is just when there's very low voltage and just a small amount of light coming into the panels, it will automatically shut them off. So they're not trying to turn on if you're just parked underneath some lights. And that's it for the charge controller. Next is the Smart Shunt. So there are quite a few settings on this one. So I've got my notes here, but go ahead and pull it up on the app. And the first thing that we're gonna need to set is the battery settings. to tell the smart shunt how many amp hours of battery storage that we have here. So the shunt's purpose is to measure the flow of current in and out of the battery system. And that is how we actually get the calculation that tells us what percentage of battery we have left and how much time we would have left at our current amp draw with the battery power that we have. So this is a really important one to set up properly. So you're going to need to go in and adjust how many amp hours of power storage you have. And so for this system, we're going to set that to 400. The next one, which is the charged voltage. The experts that I talked to at Victron say for these batteries, you'll want to put that at 13.9. So that's what it would consider to be the charged voltage for this battery before it goes into the next stage of charging. For the lithium batteries, the discharge floor, which is next, can be set to 10%. So what that's telling the system to do is that to calculate the battery percentage so that when it gets down to 10%, that would be considered empty. And this just allows you to have a little bit of room for error. If you are draining your batteries all the way down, even when you get to 0, there still should be some capacity in the system. And it's really not a good idea to run the batteries all the way dead, because at that point, since none of the equipment will start up, you can't even charge the batteries with the inverter. You actually have to put a battery charger on the batteries first. So it's a good idea to always keep some power in the batteries. Next up is the tail current, and that should be set to 4%. The charge detection time, 3 minutes. The Pukert exponent, 1.05, and this is a change from the factory defaults that are in here. Charge efficiency factor should also be changed. That should go to 99%. You can leave the current threshold at 0.1 amps. And then the time to go averaging period for 3 minutes. That's just how long is it averaging the current amp draw to determine how much time you have left with the power that's in the batteries. Okay, another important setting here, there is a battery starts synchronized on-off switch in the settings, and that should definitely be turned off, because otherwise every time you power down your batteries and you turn them back on, the shunt is going to think that they are at 100%, which you definitely don't want, because it is common to shut down your battery system when you're not using it. Ideally, when it comes back online, you want to have at least some indication of where the battery percentage had left off. Okay, and then finally, this is where you'll synchronize your batteries to the shunt, which is the battery monitor. So when you know that your batteries are all the way full, like you've charged them overnight via the shore power, and they've gone all the way through the bulk, absorption, and float stage, and the voltage is as high as it will be, you can hit the synchronize to 100%, and that tells the shunt this is full. Start doing your calculations based on this level of charge that's in the battery. So every once in a while, when you know your batteries are full, this is where you would go to synchronize them. The final is a 0 current calibration. Generally, you don't need to do anything with that. If you are getting some strange readings and it's showing that power is moving even though it's not, you would go in there and do a calibration. But generally, to get the system up and running, that's not required. Now it's time to program the BMS, and the BMS we're using is the Smart BMS CL12100. And this particular BMS is great because you need a battery management system for the batteries anyways, and they have designed in a way to handle the incoming charge from the alternator into the same unit. The CL in it stands for current limiting, and that's really important that you're putting a current limiter on the alternator connection, especially if you're using the factory alternator, because if your batteries were very low, it would be pulling so much power from the alternator that it would easily heat up and certainly reduce the lifespan. So this piece of equipment takes the current, limits it down to a much smaller number than would normally be coming through the system if it was left wide open, helping preserve the alternator and giving your batteries a consistent charge. So we're going to jump into the app here and go to the BMS. And it shows that the battery system right now is at 13.1 volts, and also shows the alternator and starter voltage, which it's connected to on the other end. And that's really useful just in case you want to know what voltage your starter battery is at. You can go in here to find out. But if we jump into the settings, then we need to set the fuse type. And without setting the fuse type, this piece of equipment will not work. And just so you guys know, the amount of power that can potentially come through into the batteries is determined by the size of the fuse. So out of the box, this will include a 100 amp fuse, and just by the programming, it will allow about 90% of that number to potentially come through the line. So we could be getting up to 90 amps of charging through the CL unit, but that also is dependent upon a couple other things like the temperature of the batteries and also the impedance in the line. So essentially, to make a long story short, if your batteries are very highly charged to a high voltage, there's going to be a lot of impedance in the line, and it will limit down the amount of charge coming through to maybe as little as 15 to 25 amps. In contrast, when the batteries are very low and the impedance is low, that's when you might be getting 70, 80, or even 90 amps coming through the line. So take that into consideration when you size your cable coming from the alternator. And then when you are in the settings, you want to select the correct amp fuse so that it knows the size of the fuse and then also where to limit the charge at. So like I said, out of the box, it's a 100 amps. So you just set 1 times 100 on the fuse type, and that will work. I don't use the pre-alarm for this unit itself, but you can set the battery charge limit to 14.2. That's the max you would want to see. Basically, once it gets to that level, the BMS will completely shut down the current coming in and disable it altogether. The final thing, back on the home page, there is a switch, an on-off switch for the BMS right here. So if you wanted to turn it off and stop it from charging, you could do it right through the app and not have to actually get back to the equipment. And that's it for the BMS. All right, here comes the fun part, which is programming the Multi-Plus inverter. It's actually not the fun part, it's the hardest part because you need a couple special pieces of equipment to do it, but it is really important. If it wasn't pre-programmed when it was sent to you, then it needs to be programmed when you start the system up. So what we're gonna need in order to do this is a laptop that's running Windows, because we'll have to download some software. We're going to also need this VE bus to USB dongle, if you will, and then an RJ45 cable, which will plug into the Multi-Plus. So the first thing I'm gonna do is remove the front cover here, because we're gonna need to get inside. Don't be afraid, but also don't touch anything until I tell you to here. The first thing to do on the computer is to download the VE Configure software. This is available on the Victron site, and we'll leave a link in the description so it will take you straight to the download for the VE Configure. We're gonna pull that up on the laptop and go through the menus here. So first step, it says, please select a communications port. So we're gonna take the unit, plug it into one of our USB outlets, and then we will plug the RJ45 into this. And then the unit here has 2 different ports where you can put in the RJ45 cables, and both of them are the same. They do the same thing, so don't worry about which one it is. Plug that in. We're gonna go to port selection up here in the top menu, select COM port, and then auto detect. And right now it seems to have found the unit, so it's going through and taking all of the current readings, and there we have it. So once you get to this screen, you know that you're going to have connected to the unit. So on the left side over here, this actually gives you information about what's going on with the inverter, how much power is coming in or out. But we're gonna look over here in each of these little tabs. We'll go through and check any changes that we might need to do. So first of all, the general settings, system frequency is 60 Hertz. AC input current limit, 30 amps would be a good setting for this. It actually can go up to 50 amps. But you do wanna check the box that says overruled by remote, because we're gonna have this connected to our Servo GX and display, and when I click this box, that means I'll be able to change the current limit on my device and not have to go in and do this. Obviously with the computer would be quite a pain every time. We're just going to go through the settings here. Grid, so we're not feeding any power back to the grid, so you can leave that as is. Transfer switch, I don't make any changes there. We'll go to the inverter now. And really there aren't any changes that needed to be made on this screen, but it's good to go through and see what the possibilities are. On the charger, this is very important here. Obviously the charger needs to be enabled, and then you do need to select your battery type. And this is really important because each battery type has its own charging profile. And if you don't get it right, then it's not going to charge the batteries properly, which over the lifespan would definitely reduce the battery's life. Okay, so as long as that is set to the right batteries, and this is clicked for lithium, not going to make any other changes. There is a virtual switch, and that's also allowing me to control the on-off of the inverter remotely through my display. So you just want to make sure that this is checked. And assistance, there's nothing in there that we need to change. So that's pretty much it. Once you've made changes though, it's really important. All it's done is change them on the software right now. It has not been sent to the inverter yet. So you need to click Send Settings. And we're basically sending over the new settings to the inverter, just the ones that we've modified right now. Everything will also stay the same, so we click OK. For the inverter, that's pretty much it. So we can actually go ahead and unplug this cable now that we had just plugged in. And I'm going to unplug it from the computer. While we're in here and we have the cover off, we can go ahead and plug in the RJ45 cable, which is going to connect to our servo. And again, it really doesn't matter which port you use. Just plug that in, and then now we're free to cover this back up. All right, the final piece of equipment we need to do is the servo. So this is the unit here. You need to make sure that all of your pieces of equipment are plugged into this. So we have a connection to our MPPT charge controller and our smart shunt. Those two are coming in there. We can also plug in tank monitors and temperature sensors down there. Once you have this set up, I'm going to show you guys what needs to be done in order to connect it to the internet. So the first thing we need to do is, again, go onto the Victron Connect app. I'm going to pull up my Servo GX, and once again go to the settings, and the first thing we need to do is connect it to the internet. So you just find your wireless network that's nearby, select it, put in the password, give it a few seconds, and then this will connect to the internet. I will say that you need to connect to a wireless network that is password protected, so it doesn't work if it's an open network. You can use your phone if you have a Wi-Fi hotspot. You can go ahead and use your phone to connect, and that's really useful because if you're out on the road and you had a problem and wanted to connect to the internet so someone like us could help you diagnose the problem, then your phone is going to be a great way to connect. That's pretty much all you need to do on this settings screen. There are quite a few other settings on here. I don't change any of them. There's a wireless access point, which you can enable or disable. I just leave it on for this unit in case I want to use it. But that's pretty much it for the servo in terms of getting it connected to the internet. Once that's done, then now you have the option to get onto the VRM, the Victron Remote Management System. And as long as this is connected to the internet and all these pieces of equipment are connected to the servo, then you can see remotely everything that's going on with the system. So the way that you do that is to click on the VRM online portal. And if it's your first time connecting, or if you've never done this before, first of all, you'll need to set up an account with a username and password. There will be one more screen if it's your first time connecting to this servo, just allowing you to get access to it. If somebody else has already set this up, then you actually need to request access from them. They'll get an email, and then they'll know to go into the system and allow access for other people. But you can see here, this is currently connected, and all of the information that the servo is collecting is available online and on this screen, which is really great. So one other thing I wanted to show you guys, since we just finished programming the Multi Plus, If you want to control the on, off, and the current limit of the Multi Plus, there are two ways to do it without having to actually get in here and push the buttons or connect to the VE Connect system. And that is by using that RJ45 cable and plugging it in here to the VE bus connection, which is on the back part of this. Click that in. And now I can control the inverter, whether it's on or off, and the current from my Serbo GX display. The other way to do it would be connecting that same cable to this device right here. And if you don't have the Serbo in the display, this is kind of a manual way to turn the inverter on and off, and also to set the current limit. And the reason we do that is because often the inverter is stashed away somewhere that's hard to get to, and you don't want to leave your inverter on if you're not using it because it's a constant power draw. So that's why these remote controls for them are something that definitely should be in your system. So on this one, I have it set up for both. I'm not using the multi-control right now. Instead, I'm going to connect it to my Serbo, and then I'll show you guys how to get on the display and set that up and control the inverter from the display. We've powered up our display, and there's a few settings that you should definitely go in and change so that you can get the most out of the display. When you tap on any of the screens, you'll get the menu to come up. And once you are in the menu screen, each of the pieces of equipment that's plugged into the Serbo will show up here. So for instance, my Multi Plus is there. It's showing the smart shunt and the charge controller, or the solar charger. And one of the settings that I like to change is when you go into the settings menu and click on display and language. Show the boat and motorhome overview. I like to have that on, as well as the tanks overview, because we're also going to put some tank sensors and we'll know the level of our tanks. And then when you go back to your pages, that is going to show your tanks here, and then also allow you to connect to your inverter and change those settings as I was just talking about right here. It also gives you an additional display which shows the level of your tanks, which is really cool. So the factory default setting for this does not have all this information, so that's why you want to go into the settings menu and enable the RV view. Okay, so let's go back, click on the screen here, go to menu, see what other settings you might want to change in here. This is, you can update your firmware, set your date and time, change the display and language. If you need information about the VRM online portal, you can click on that, and it's going to give you your portal ID. And sometimes, depending on how you set up the system, if you're not the original one to set up, you might need the portal ID in order to connect to the VRM. Okay, but back to our menu here, our pages. So right now I can click on these buttons and turn the inverter on and off, and also set the current limit. So you tap on it, it goes through a couple seconds to confirm, and then I just heard the inverter turn on. And then also setting the current limit. This is really important because there are different current amount of power available depending on the type of receptacle you're using. So sometimes you'll go to an RV campground and you might have 30 amp plug available to you, but your standard home outlet is really only going to put off 15 amps. So if you tried to plug in your van to your home outlet and it kept popping the breaker, this is where you would want to go in and adjust it down to 15 or even lower. It just kind of depends. If the breaker is not able to handle the amount of power that you're pulling, especially because you're going to be charging generally for multiple hours, you can change it right there. That's what it takes to program the Victron power system and get it up and running at its peak performance. It took me a long time to learn all these settings, so I'm really happy to pass this along to you guys and get you up and running faster. This is a system that we do all the time and we know a lot about, and we offer this as a bundle. So if you want a system just like this, check out the link in the description. You can buy all of this equipment. It comes in a big box and you can put it on just like we did. And of course, if you have questions, you can always give us a call. All right, that's it for this week's video. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you again next time.